We're excited today to talk with Markus Garlauskas, an independent strategic analyst, author, and consultant about how to manage relations with North Korea during this COVID-19 period. You should have all received his full bio, but until recently, Markus served as a National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and he led the intelligence community's strategic analysis on North Korea while serving as the DNI's senior subject matter expert on North Korean issues in support of the DNI's role as the principal intelligence advisor to the president. For those of you who have a question for Markus, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Markus, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Troy, thanks for the opportunity. It's really great to be here. It's especially a great opportunity because of the great history that we've had with KEI. So I'm really appreciative of you giving us this chance.
No, we're really grateful that you could come on today. Maybe just to sort of turn into this question. I mentioned in my brief intro COVID-19, and COVID-19 has become sort of an unexpected variable in the United States' relationship with North Korea. It's clearly difficult to know what exactly is going on inside North Korea, but what dimensions or types of things should we be considering when we think about how the pandemic is actually affecting decision-making inside North Korea?
So I think it's very true to call it an unexpected variable, quintessential black swan, unpredictable event with a major impact. And certainly it's not something that any of us would have had in mind last year when we were thinking about forecasting what North Korea's behavior in 2020 would look like. So when I think about the effects, there's really three main dimensions that I would consider. The first and the foremost, I think, is that North Korea has to show strength domestically and internationally that COVID is not going to stop North Korea in its tracks. So you may recall back in January, North Korea was already taking countermeasures, and you had all this media buzz about how North Korea was going to be hit really hard by COVID and how bad it was going to be. But by March, you got North Korea doing these large-scale artillery drills, firing ballistic missiles, and you got KCNA showing pictures with Kim Jong-un observing live fires, but everybody around him is wearing a mask. So that's one variable. Second one is on the effects of trade and on the aid. So to reduce the potential for exposure to COVID, as you know, early on, North Korea isolated itself, which led to a further drop in foreign currency income and trade on top of what it was already suffering from sanctions. And so on one hand, you can think of that being a constraint on North Korea's resources and its decision-making. However, that means North Korea is relying on aid rather than trade, and really means that sanctions relief at the moment really doesn't do them all that much good. And I particularly found it interesting that Radio Free Asia last month reported, but very quiet aid shipments coming from China to North Korea. And so there's signs that North Korea is actually recovering from the sanctions evasion through sanctions evasion as well, and that they're having the ability now to restore the same level, for example, the coal smuggling they had before. So that's the second big effect. And then lastly is in a conduct of diplomacy. The practical effects of COVID make it difficult for diplomats to travel. And so there's a limit to how much North Korea is going to be able to put stock in some major diplomatic efforts as long as COVID is restricting that. So overall, I think given what we've seen, the activity, the messaging, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that North Korea's decision-making has now reached the point where, yeah, they still have to deal with COVID, but their focus is really shifting more to international and national security matters.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised the economic side of things, because I was looking actually at the Chinese trade data just yesterday. And while exports from North Korea are still very minimal on the official level, about 4-point-something million, if I remember correctly, it's still about 70% less of what they imported last year from China, but there's been a significant increase, in the last month or so from what were really basically complete closure of the border to where, it was very minimal numbers under, $1 million to now back up to, I think it was $54 million worth of imports last month. So it's been at least for a short period of time, was a very big effect. But to sort of tie back into this whole issue of, the decision-making process of COVID, how they're dealing with it. And you kind of talked about this early on that, we had these sort of concerns about North Korea early on in the year. North Korea had pledged to deploy a new strategic weapon, but weapon tests have actually slowed since the second half of last year. Kim Jong-un even sent Moon Jae-in condolence letter over COVID-19 in March. But then we saw these escalating tensions. We had the destruction of the liaison office, for example. But then North Korea seemed to back down. Is North Korea just adapting rapidly to changing circumstances, such as South Korea's response to its own actions? Or are there other factors that we should be thinking about in this decision-making process?
So I think we've seen a lot of consistency in North Korea's overall strategy and behavior. Now, we do see those tactical adjustments that you're talking about, evolution to changing circumstances as they see what's working and what isn't. But honestly, I'm very skeptical of analytic models that seek to explain North Korean behavior as really reactive rather than proactive. And I'm also skeptical of the idea that when we see some time between Kim saying he's going to do something, giving a warning, and then he does it, that this necessarily means he's hesitating. So I thought this new strategic weapon reference, that's a good example to focus on. Just because it hasn't been revealed, I don't think we should be surprised. I think we have to consider there's a lot of factors, not just the decision at Kim's level that bear on the timeline for something like this. The fact that we haven't seen that, meaning that Kim has really changed his mind or that he's delayed. So remember back at the beginning of 2017, Kim said in his New Year's address that they would soon be testing an ICBM. But we didn't see the first launch until the 4th of July. And then it took until late November before they launched the Hwasong 15 and they declared success. So hold on to your hat. I think we'll still see that strategic weapon come out this year.
Well, I think you make a really great point there. Hopefully we don't see it come out, but I think you're right that we sometimes maybe look too quickly for a response. But, one of the other things that's been sort of interesting about COVID-19, or at least this period, has been the effort to raise the profile of Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister. And, we saw, or at least the belief is that the sinking of the Chonan was attributed to Kim Jong-un to help begin the development of his leadership credentials. Kim Yo-jong has really sort of become the public face of the recent tensions with South Korea. She even spoke recently about this proposed potential summit. She, in terms of the actual destruction of the liaison office, had foreshadowed it. Are we seeing a sort of a similar type of dynamic potentially taking place right here with Kim Yo-jong? Or, are there other things that we should be considering in terms of why her profile has been essentially been rising recently?
So overall, I think this is a really good, important question. And I think we do have to look closely at Kim Yo-jong and her status. But in general, I'm skeptical of domestic political explanations, like changes in position or who's in favor, who's out, as an actual driver of external behavior. And I know that good friends and smart people, we can disagree on that. But I think tracking the shifts in the regime leadership and how you see the state media portraying Kim Yo-jong, I think that's actually far more useful to show as a manifestation, as an indicator of the regime's intentions and the narrative that in this case Kim Jong-un is trying to build, rather than as a driver of the decision-making. So there's a couple adages here. The first one, correlation is not causation. So just because we see these changes doesn't mean that's what the cause of the changes was. And if anything, I think it's more looking at how do they put the right people in the right position to say the things that need to be said or take the actions that need to be taken. And there's a second adage, you've heard this one before, I'm sure, from the Reagan administration: personnel are policy, right? I think that adage applies even more in Pyongyang, in an environment where the leaders got absolute power and the ability to move people around. I think it's really important to look at how these people are portrayed and how they move as an indicator of what the regime is trying to tell us and what they're preparing to do. And so I'm not the first one who made the observation, but I really think Kim Yo-jong out in front as the face of the escalation towards South Korea made it much easier to pivot away from that when the time was right than having Kim Jong-un as the face of it. I think there's no question Kim Yo-jong, she's an important figure, and regime leadership system is not set up to have a number two. The only person who ever really had that status and kept it for very long was Kim Jong-il himself as he was preparing to assume the leadership. So I don't find myself agreeing with the Russian ambassador to North Korea very often, but as he pointed out the other day, it wouldn't really be wise to dare to be the number two in the North Korean system, and Kim Yo-jong doesn't look to be positioning for that. But that said, you mentioned the Jonguns. And I think the focus on Kim Yo-jong has actually obscured another noteworthy phenomenon in leadership. I'm actually far more interested in what has been going on with Vice Chairman Kim Yong-chol and his return to prominence last month, given his involvement in the Cheonan sinking and other provocations. The fact that Kim Yo-jong got a mention in state media in relation to this decision to cut off communications to the South, that got a lot of attention. But it's also worth noting Kim Yong-chol's name was actually mentioned first in that state media report. So I think we need to keep an eye on people more than just Yo-jong. Keep an eye on her, but keep an eye on other key figures in the regime.
So I want to take this conversation in a slightly different direction now, because we've talked about sort of the constraints and the leadership, but there's also a question in some ways about the opportunities for North Korea. We've seen China has been relatively more aggressive, at least in its stances. You had the border skirmish with India. You've seen the decision to move forward with the new national security law in Hong Kong. Given the distraction, at least, in the United States, still dealing with the outbreak of COVID-19, do you think North Korea might see an opportunity to perhaps take some steps they might not under normal circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. And personally, I think they'd be badly miscalculating if they think that being more assertive while the United States is dealing with COVID is going to be advantageous for them. I think when it comes to North Korea, what I've seen lately is the U.S. is actually more sensitive than distracted, as we saw in the tremendous amount of attention that Kim's 3-week absence got. That having been said, the North Koreans do miscalculate, and I do look to take advantage of periods where they think the U.S. is distracted. There's this recurring theme in their propaganda, and sometimes they believe their own propaganda, that the U.S. is this overextended imperial power, that it's got these endless global wars and these deep domestic class and racial divisions that are going to bring it down. And so they actually have this as part of their strategic thinking, I think, to see opportunities to look at the U.S. as this distracted imperial power. So you see the United States was tied down in the Vietnam War in late 68 and 69. And that's when North Korea really ramps up the provocations. And so they're able to kill U.S. service members. They see the ship, they shoot down a plane. And the question is, would we have taken the chance to escalate in response if we hadn't been tied on Vietnam? Maybe.
So, all right, apologies. We may need a moment here. Marcus, it looks like it's frozen. Marcus, maybe if you can try to take and go out of the program and then come back in. So while we take a moment to wait for Marcus to log back into the system and hopefully resume our conversation with him, just as a reminder, anybody who has a question for Marcus, if you could just take and use the Q&A function, so that way we can have those going forward. And also, just to let you know, since we have a moment, we do have a program this coming Thursday. I think we have a slide real quick that we'll put up. It's China's Rise and the American Response. This program is built off of what would have been our academic symposium at the International Studies Association. That obviously, with COVID-19, this conference was canceled earlier this year. But we pulled together some interesting papers. Gil Rosman will be taking part. Former Congressman Charles Boustany will be taking part. Scott Harold from the RAND Corporation. And my apologies if I forgot one of the potential speakers in that program. But I think this will be a really great discussion as well. And I hope you're able to join in for that on Thursday. So while we wait for Marcus, I'll also take this opportunity. There's a question from Jae-soo from the Korean Embassy. He asks, because of sanctions and the shutdown of COVID-19, North Korea should have experienced a severe economic hardship this year. However, traffic in Pyongyang seems to be normal and people's life is as well. What is the explanation for North Korea's resilience? I think this is an interesting question to try and dig into. You have a situation right now to where we've seen from satellite imagery that there was a period to where North Korean smuggling did stop, though there's been indications that that has resumed as well. There also has been a situation to where you have the legal trade between China and North Korea came to a halt, as I mentioned previously. that has picked back up. I think what we've seen right now, when you look at the situation in North Korea, is that they have been able to get by. There have been indications of some price swings, some movement from rice to corn, which is a cheaper substitutable good. So you've seen that there. There have been indications that the regime is really focused on primarily importing necessities now rather than other types of commercial goods. There have been reports that that's going to be the case for the rest of the year. But we've also seen, I mentioned the trade data, and the new data should come out in a few days for June. But in May, what we saw was, in essence, a return to the importation primarily of different food items. Those were amongst the top imports. Also, plastics, for example, that are used in agriculture for in greenhouses and other things to take and grow plants. So at least what we can see on the illicit side of the coin, there does seem to be a strong movement to trying to import the necessities that are needed to take and try and keep, at least from a food situation, the economy running. Now, that being said, there are going to be other challenges on the industrial side, and there are going to be limits in terms of what North Korea is able to export. And even on the smuggling side, you have a situation to where basically anyone who goes into North Korea still has to quarantine when they come back. And so as they do, that then takes and limits some of the options for smuggling. And, thank you. We have Markus back here now. So Markus, I'll be honest, I don't quite remember where we got cut off. So maybe what I'll do is I had a few more questions for you. I was just going through one of the questions from one of the panelists. So maybe I'll start with that and then, or let you comment on that as well. And then I'll take and move back to some of our questions before we go back to maybe broader audience questions. So we had a question from the Korean embassy from Jesu, who basically asked, because of sanctions and COVID-19, we would have expected there to be a severe economic hardship in North Korea this year, but life seems to be somewhat normal. How do we explain this type of resilience?
Yeah, so I think North Korea has got a long history of being resilient. And when you look at the arduous March period in the late 1990s, how much North Korea changed as a result of that period. I mean, North Korea went from a society where the people were used to relying on getting what they needed from the state to getting to defending for themselves. And so I think that's a fundamental change. That means that North Korea, basically at the very low level of society, is much more resilient in the face of these sorts of challenges, much less reliant on the sorts of resources and the sorts of trade that's going to show up kind of at the national level. And they're basically relying on local small scale transactions to get what they need. So I think that's one element. And I think the other element too is recognizing that even though North Korea relies a great deal on trade with the outside world to get some of the things that it wants, that overall North Korean society, the North Korean system is designed and has been designed to rely a lot less on trade than your typical modern society. And so I think you combine those two elements, and that tells an important story. I think the other thing to keep in mind is there's still a lot of smuggling going on, right? And just because these transactions don't show up in the trade statistics, you've got a society that's been very good at getting around restrictions. That can, of course, backfire on them because they can get around their own restrictions sometimes. And so when Kim Jong-un closes down the border, that doesn't necessarily mean the border's closed. But certainly, I think you take those in combination, and then of course the aid that from China, purchase of grain from Russia, these sorts of things. I mean, I personally am not surprised that they've been this resilient, but I think that they got to this point basically through a generation's worth of adaptation.
So, one of the things that I think as we look forward to how relations between the United States and North Korea might develop is that there's essentially three periods. There's the pre-election period before the presidential election in the United States. There's this COVID-19 period, which clearly there's some overlap with the election period, but also we don't quite know how long it'll be till COVID-19 is no longer really a major issue. And then there's a post-COVID period. So I'd like to sort of start with the election period. Recent polling has indicated that President Trump is significantly trailing former President Biden. That obviously could change. President Trump was trailing Secretary Hillary Clinton in 2016 and was able to win. But from the North Korean perspective, we've seen this discussion of a potential summit. Are there any incentives for really engaging the Trump administration before the election and they know who's won? Or does the COVID-19 situation maybe change that calculation for them?
So I know that there's a lot of talk about the potential for an October surprise or for a summit, and I'm skeptical of that possibility. I've written on this recently. I think right now both North Korea and the United States they have a desire to have the other partner to make a significant change before they would be willing to re-engage in the summit. That's been the message basically both capitals have been putting out. In particular, I think Kim wants to re-engage, but only on his terms. When you look at what happened at the Hanoi summit, that was not good for Kim, right? He goes home, he's upset, he purges people in the leadership, he fires other people, including Kim Yong-chol, who I mentioned earlier, removes them from the positions in negotiations. And so he's not eager to rush into another situation like that. And so Kim's got this pattern of trying to re-engage only after establishing or at least portraying a position of strength, right? So when you look at 2017, that was a really big year for North Korea's weapons programs, sixth and largest ever underground nuclear test, conducts its first ICBM test, and tests an even bigger ICBM that can hit all the U.S. in their claim. And all after this, it's only then in his New Year's address where Kim declares the success of the testing, orders mass production of nuclear warheads and missiles, but then shifts to establishing the position of diplomatic strength. So he sets the groundwork with South Korea, then he goes to have the summit with Xi, then he has a summit with President Moon, then another summit with Xi, and only after this is he really ready to engage with President Trump at Singapore. And so this all takes time, and I think that's the sort of conditions under which we're going to see Kim really try and re-engage at the higher level. Now, lower level positioning, I wouldn't rule that out. I'm really skeptical of this idea that there's going to be this October surprise summit. You can't rule anything out. I don't see that being part of what we're going to see leading up to the U.S. election. In contrast, I think we may see something, as I mentioned, on this front of the new strategic weapon, but that doesn't necessarily mean a test. I mean, they have this opportunity with the parade, the 75th anniversary, which comes on 10 October. So there's an opportunity there to unveil the weapon without necessarily testing it. If they avoid a major provocation so close to the election, well, they're building up the buzz on a display it at around that time, and then they. So one of the possibilities that I would be thinking about. But overall, I don't see it's very likely, or it's much in North Korea's interest to have a big October surprise, either some kind of major overture to get to a summit, or some kind of really truly provocative action. I think that probably doesn't come until after the election.
So just because we're a little short on time, I want to maybe take and combine sort of the COVID period, which we touched on a little bit about how COVID is actually impacting North Korea, but with sort of the post-COVID period. What should the United States, maybe South Korea, be doing to basically best be positioned to re-engage with North Korea once COVID-19 isn't really a factor? And what should that maybe engagement look like potentially?
Sure. I mean, I think as you see these indicators of Kim trying to establish his position of strength to be able to go into another round of negotiations, it's really important. And I know this sounds basic, but I think it bears repeating to make sure that Seoul and Washington are operating off a common strategy and common principles. even if our tactics and the messages of Kim are going to be a little bit different, that doesn't mean that you can't have a united strategy. And I think it's particularly important to stand firm and show unity when the North is testing weapons in violation of UN resolutions or otherwise being provocative. That's a window of opportunity to reinvigorate the pressure campaign, which is not mutually exclusive with setting conditions for engagement. And you got to be prepared to move quickly if North Korea does do something provocative, does do a weapons test in violation of UN resolutions, because that window isn't going to last. Those provocations should be followed very quickly by another pivot to engagement. And it's proven hard to keep the pressure on or to up the pressure when he is willing to engage when he stopped testing. So we need to be ready for both of those, for the provocation and then that potential re-engagement after, and to really look at it for what it is, as a manipulative strategy with very, very clear eyes. And I think this applies whenever you're engaging with North Korea, whether it's post-COVID, pre-COVID, pre-election, post-election. I think that those are really the two fundamental principles that I'd emphasize.
All right, thank you. So I have at least a couple questions in the queue that I want to try and get to from the audience. And one of them is fairly straightforward. It's from Jonguns from Radio Free Asia. And she asks essentially, what is your view on the WHO's recent report that there are no COVID cases in North Korea?
Well, I didn't read the report word for word, but it was my interpretation that they had no positive COVID tests was what the WHO was reporting, and that's not the same thing. And also, I emphasize too what I said earlier. North Korea has been putting restrictions against the spread of COVID in place since back in January. This is the most oppressive, restrictive society in human history, right? In terms of restricting the movement of information, of people, of ideas. And so the idea that they could clamp down to the point where they don't have COVID penetrating through their society, that's not an unrealistic possibility. I don't buy the idea that they never had any COVID cases, but the fact that they might not have had any actual positive tests come back, I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, I don't know the details of who was tested and why, and I'm not an expert on virus spread and COVID testing, but I would say just because what the WHO said was they got no positive tests doesn't mean there was never COVID in North Korea.
So also have a question from Dagyum Ji from Voice of America. North Korea's leadership has openly said it would bolster up its nuclear war deterrence or war deterrence. Some U.S. experts have said that this is just a tactical move to send a message to the U.S. From your perspective, what are the policy implications? Are we returning to Byungjin policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, in some ways, we never really truly fully left the Byungjin policy, despite the rhetoric. I mean, I think Kim hoped, in essence, that he would be able to have his deterrent and his trade and his positive relationship with the U.S. too. I don't think he ever really abandoned that idea, even if the Byungjin terminology went out of use. And I think that North Korea has made it very clear that they do not want to give up their nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future, that they want to strengthen their capability to strike the United States, to strike in the region with nuclear weapons. And I think that's a fundamental part of their strategic calculus. And so even if they've repackaged it a little bit and since the Singapore summit, I think they're actually more returning to form in many ways. These statements are very much, I think, a part of North Korea's basic strategy of relying first and foremost on strengthening the nuclear capability, nuclear deterrent as a bedrock for its security.
So I do want to try and keep close to our time, but maybe one last brief question, since there's just one more left here that I have in the chat function. It's from our Vice President, Mark Tokla. Probably the easiest question you'll get. What does North Korea want?
Right. So I think what North Korea wants and what Kim Jong-un wants are two different things. They're related. But I think ultimately the Kim regime and Kim himself wants to perpetuate the rule of himself and of the Kim family in perpetuity. And to achieve that, they have to maintain control inside the country. and they have to establish as much dominance as possible over South Korea. And they have to break the ROK-U.S. alliance and get U.S. forces off the peninsula. And they have to establish a truly credible nuclear deterrent against the United States, so they have a free hand to do what they need to do in their minds for the regime to survive. So it's a very tall order, but it all comes down to, and I know it sounds trite, it comes down to regime survival. I mean, they see themselves as in a zero-sum war for survival, and I think that's going to be first and foremost in the Kim regime's mind. I think the average North Korean just wants to live, wants to have their next meal, to take care of their children, and to live their life. But I don't think that's first and foremost in Kim Jong-un's mind.
Well, Markus, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been a really insightful conversation. And thank you for answering the hardest question, which is, what does North Korea really want? I think you did a really great job there. And thank you again, and look forward to seeing you a post-COVID-19 period. Thank you.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you very much.